Imagine plummeting through Earth's atmosphere at blistering speeds, encased in plasma hot enough to melt steel, with no way to communicate, and relying on a critical component that NASA knew was broken. This is the untold story of Artemis II, a mission that pushed the very limits of trust and engineering, revealing a harrowing truth about humanity's return to the Moon. On the evening of April 10, 2026, 4 human beings fell through the atmosphere at nearly 40,233 kilometers per hour, surrounded by plasma hot enough to melt steel, with no way to talk to anyone on the ground. They were protected by a heat shield that NASA already knew was broken. Not broken in theory, but in practice. It had been tested once before on an uncrewed flight, and returned with chunks missing. In over 100 locations, the material had cracked, fractured, and blown off in fragments, instead of melting away as designed. Yet, despite this undeniable evidence, NASA strapped 4 human beings to it anyway: Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, 3 Americans and a Canadian, sealed inside a capsule named Integrity, about to discover if that name was earned or tragically ironic. To understand why those minutes above the Pacific Ocean were the most dangerous any astronaut had faced in decades, one must first grasp what went wrong 3.5 years earlier on a flight without a crew on board. In December 2022, NASA launched Artemis I. No astronauts, just the Orion spacecraft on a test run around the Moon and back. The flight itself proceeded flawlessly. Orion circled the Moon, captured breathtaking photographs, and returned screaming towards Earth exactly as planned. The re-entry appeared clean. The capsule splashed down in the Pacific off the coast of Baja California, and recovery teams swiftly retrieved it from the water. Mission accomplished, or so they thought. When teams flipped the capsule over and examined its underside, a troubling reality emerged. The heat shield, a 5.03-meter-wide disc made of a material called Avcoat, was supposed to have charred evenly and predictably during re-entry. This is the fundamental principle of ablative shields. They absorb heat by burning away in a controlled, predictable fashion, layer by layer, much like a candle melting from the outside in. Orion's shield, however, had not behaved as expected. Instead, large pieces of the outer char layer had cracked apart and blown off in chunks. These weren't small chips. They were fragments substantial enough for NASA's Office of Inspector General to describe them as creating a visible trail of debris behind the spacecraft. Engineers found damage in over 100 locations across the shield's surface. Had astronauts been inside, they probably would have survived. The capsule's inner structure, it seemed, had held. Temperatures inside remained in the mid-20s Celsius, and the shield, despite looking like it had been attacked, did technically protect the vehicle. And that word, technically, was doing a tremendous amount of work in that sentence. NASA launched an extensive investigation involving over 100 tests at facilities across the country. This included arc jet testing at Ames Research Center in California, laser testing, and numerous hypersonic wind tunnel runs. Engineers pulled roughly 200 samples of Avcoat from the recovered shield and sent them to Marshall Spaceflight Center in Alabama for analysis. The investigation dragged on for nearly 2 years. In December 2024, they finally published the root cause. The Avcoat material wasn't porous enough. During re-entry, the material heats up and undergoes a process called pyrolysis. Essentially, combustion without oxygen, which generates gas inside the shield. On a properly permeable heat shield, these gases seep outward through the charred outer layer, dissipating harmlessly. On Artemis I, however, these gases had no escape. The outer char layer sealed itself too tightly, trapping the gas underneath. Pressure built, cracks formed, and when the capsule dipped back into the atmosphere for the second phase of its skip re-entry, those pressurized pockets detonated outward, popping chunks of the char layer off like blisters bursting on severely sunburned skin. The irony was profound. Apollo engineers had known about this exact problem half a century prior. The original Avcoat formulation used on the Apollo command modules was designed with permeability as a key design consideration. Apollo capsules, which also utilize skip re-entry trajectories, never encountered heat shield issues. The Artemis version of Avcoat had been reformulated slightly, and critically, nobody realized this change had compromised its ability to breathe, until pieces of the shield were observed floating in the Pacific Ocean. That discovery created a problem with no clean solution. NASA ordered a redesigned, more permeable heat shield for future Artemis missions, beginning with Artemis III. The fix for Artemis II was another matter entirely. By the time the Artemis I capsule splashed down and engineers started cutting into its shield, the Artemis II heat shield was already built and bolted onto the spacecraft. Replacing it would mean years of additional delay for a program already half a decade behind schedule. Alarmingly, the Artemis II shield was even less permeable than the one that had failed on Artemis I, as NASA had deliberately made it denser to test the bonding strength between the shield and Orion's hull. Faced with this impossible dilemma, they made a controversial decision: fly it as is. Their reasoning was as follows. The damage on Artemis I was caused specifically by the skip reentry profile, a technique where the capsule dips into the atmosphere, bounces back up, and then plunges in again for a second, deeper phase. During that atmospheric bounce, the outer char layer cooled and sealed, while the inner layers remained scorching hot, trapping gas with no escape. If they altered the re-entry trajectory to maintain continuous high temperatures on the heat shield throughout the descent, the outer char layer would theoretically remain permeable, allowing gases to vent normally. Instead of skipping like a stone across water, Artemis II would take a steeper, more direct path, a loft instead of a skip. The strategy was to come in fast, come in hot, and not give the shield time to seal itself shut. Former astronaut Charles Camarda publicly disagreed. Camarda, a heat shield expert who had been part of the first shuttle crew to fly after the Columbia disaster, estimated the probability of catastrophic failure at 1 in 20, or a 5% chance of failure, a 95% chance of success. While a 95% success rate might sound reassuring, it pales in comparison to NASA's own safety threshold for crew loss during re-entry, which is roughly 1 in 500. Camarda drew uncomfortable parallels, comparing the analytical tools NASA used to evaluate the shield to the same institutional failures that led to the Challenger and Columbia disasters. He argued that the agency had not fully modeled how cracks could propagate under the modified trajectory, and that the decision to fly was driven more by schedule pressure than by engineering certainty. The ghost that hung over the entire discussion, the one nobody at NASA wanted to invoke but everyone was thinking about, was Columbia. On February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry when superheated air penetrated a breach in its thermal protection system, caused by a piece of foam insulation that had struck the wing during launch 16 days earlier. All 7 crew members died. The foam strike had been observed on launch cameras. Engineers at NASA had flagged it. Management had declined to investigate further, reasoning that similar foam strikes had occurred on previous flights without catastrophic consequences. The institutional logic that killed those 7 astronauts was that the system had worked before, so it would probably work again. 23 years later, NASA was asking the Artemis II crew to trust a heat shield that had visibly failed on its only previous flight. The parallels were so unsettling that Camarda explicitly invoked Columbia by name in his public criticism. NASA pushed back. Engineers ran worst-case simulations where entire blocks of Avcoat were stripped away during descent and found that Orion's underlying composite structure, reinforced with titanium, could survive even that extreme scenario. An independent review team meticulously examined all the test data and ultimately agreed with NASA's conclusions. Commander Reed Wiseman told reporters he had personally sat in the engineering meetings, walked through the data himself, and was satisfied. He stated, "If we stick to the new re-entry path that NASA has planned, then this heat shield will be safe to fly." On April 1, 2026, at 6:35 in the evening, NASA's Space Launch System rocket lifted off from Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center, carrying the 4 astronauts on the first crewed flight to the Moon since Apollo 17 in December 1972. 53 years, more than half a century, had passed since any human being had left low Earth orbit. The rocket worked flawlessly. The spacecraft performed as expected. The translunar injection burn, a 6-minute firing of Orion's main engine, pushed the crew out of Earth orbit and onto a trajectory toward the Moon. For the next several days, the crew meticulously tested Orion's systems in deep space, checking life support, running navigation procedures, practicing manual piloting, and eating rehydrated macaroni and cheese from pouches. On April 6th, they flew around the moon. They set a new record for the farthest distance any human had ever traveled from Earth, 406,787 kilometers, surpassing Apollo 13 by over 6,437 kilometers. They witnessed a solar eclipse from behind the moon that Glover would later call the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They named a crater after Wiseman's late wife, Carol. In a moment that brought the entire crew to tears on live television, they spent a week and a half meticulously testing every system on a spacecraft that had never carried people before. By all accounts, Orion performed beautifully, but none of that mattered if they couldn't get home. On the evening of April 10th, the crew of Artemis II was falling toward the atmosphere. At 7:33 in the evening Eastern Time, the crew module separated from the European-built service module. The service module, which had powered Orion for the entire journey, was now jettisoned. No longer needed, it would burn up over the Pacific. Orion was now on its own. An 18-second burn from Orion's thrusters precisely aligned the heat shield with the planet below. Everything now hinged on geometry. The angle of attack had to be precise. Too steep, and the capsule would decelerate too violently, subjecting the crew to forces that could cause blackouts or worse. Too shallow, and it would skip off the atmosphere like a rock off a lake, sailing back into the void with no hope of return. At 7:53 p.m., Orion crossed 121,920 meters. This was entry interface. The capsule was traveling at nearly 35 times the speed of sound, roughly 39,688 kilometers per hour, about 209 kilometers per hour short of the all-time record set by Apollo 10 in 1969. The atmosphere, thin as a whisper at that altitude, began to bite. Within seconds, the air molecules piling up against the heat shield compressed and superheated into plasma. The capsule vanished inside a sheath of ionized gas, glowing at nearly 2,760 degrees Celsius, half the temperature of the sun's surface. Through the windows, the crew watched the world turn to fire. If you have ever seen re-entry footage, you know what this looks like from the outside. A streak of white and orange light arcing across the sky like a slow-motion meteor. From the inside, it looks like the windows are melting. At 1 minute and 22 seconds after entry interface, the shield hit peak heating. This was the moment of truth. The Avcoat was supposed to be charring evenly, shedding heat layer by layer, its gases venting outward through a permeable outer crust. If it wasn't performing as designed, if the char layer was sealing, if pressure pockets were forming as they had on Artemis I, there was absolutely nothing the crew could do. There is no escape system during re-entry, no abort, no eject button, no backup shield. NASA builds redundancy into nearly everything it flies, but not the heat shield. It either works or it doesn't. And to compound the terror, the crew couldn't even communicate what they were seeing to mission control. The plasma surrounding the capsule was not just hot, it was electrically charged, blocking radio signals the same way a wall of static drowns out a conversation. Communications went dead. A planned blackout. Yes. Expected. Yes. Accounted for in every simulation. Absolutely. But that does not make it any less terrifying when it is happening to you. For 6 minutes, Wiseman, Glover, and Hansen were the loneliest people in the solar system, falling through fire at nearly 4 times the force of gravity, with no one on the ground able to hear them, see their telemetry, or help them if something went wrong. At Mission Control in Houston, Flight Director Jeff Radigan and his team sat in silence. Flight Director Jeff Radigan had described it beforehand with the kind of profound understatement that astronauts and flight controllers specialize in. He had said, "We'll just be thinking through things to keep ourselves calm as we wait for reacquisition of signal." Think about what that means. A room full of the most capable aerospace engineers on the planet, people who had spent years training for this exact moment. Staring at screens that showed nothing, listening to speakers that played nothing, knowing that 4 of their colleagues were inside a burning capsule with a known defective shield, and that the next voice they heard would either confirm that everything worked or that it didn't. There was no third option. For those 6 agonizing minutes, the crew felt 3.9 Gs during peak deceleration, nearly 4 times their body weight pressing them into their seats. Breathing becomes deliberate at that level, You have to consciously squeeze air into your lungs against the immense force trying to flatten your chest. Your vision narrows. Your arms weigh 18 kilograms each. If something went wrong with the capsule's orientation and it started tumbling, you physically could not reach the controls. The capsule itself was shaking, not gently. The entire vehicle was vibrating as superheated air battered it from every direction. Through the windows, if you could turn your head far enough to look, you saw nothing but orange and white plasma. No stars, no earth, no sky, just fire. Retired astronaut Butch Wilmore, who has experienced reentry on previous missions, described the blackout as the loneliest feeling in spaceflight. He explained, "You know the blackout's coming, but knowing doesn't help. You are still inside a burning machine with no radio and no options, counting the seconds until the plasma clears and the signal comes back." Then, just before 8 p.m., a voice crackled through the static. "Houston, integrity, we have you loud and clear." It was Reed Wiseman, calm, steady, as if he had just walked in from checking the mail. The shield held. The modified trajectory worked. The continuous heating kept the Avcoat permeable. The gases vented, and the char layer eroded the way it was supposed to, slowly and predictably, without cracking, fracturing, or blowing chunks of itself into the hypersonic slipstream. 2.5 years of engineering analysis and 100 tests across the country had produced the right answer. Camarda's 1 in 20 scenario did not materialize. The audacious bet had paid off. What followed happened fast. At 6,706 meters, 2 drogue parachutes deployed, yanking Orion's speed from thousands of kilometers per hour down to about 494 kilometers per hour. A minute later, at 1,829 meters, 3 massive main parachutes billowed open, each one the size of a football field, hauling the capsule down to a gentle 27 kilometers per hour. At 8:07 p.m. Eastern Time, Orion hit the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego with what NASA's commentator called a perfect bullseye splashdown. The entire reentry, from entry interface to splashdown, lasted just 13 minutes. The blackout accounted for 6 of those. The peak heating phase, the 4 minutes when the shield was under maximum stress and the crew was utterly alone, is what the mission will be remembered for long after the engineering reports are archived and the press conferences are forgotten. Because the thing nobody talks about enough is the invisible weight those 4 people carried into that capsule with them. Not just the flight data, the checklists, and the procedures rehearsed 1,000 times. They carried something heavier than all of that. Reed Wiseman carried 2 daughters who had already lost their mother. He had posted a selfie with Katie and Ellie before launch and written, "I love these 2 ladies and I'm boarding that rocket, a very proud father." 6 years earlier, his wife Carol had been diagnosed with cancer. She told him not to quit NASA, not to move the family closer to their relatives back east. She said, "This is where you work and you love your job. We should not give that up for this." She died in May 2020 at the age of 46. He raised the girls alone, trained for the most dangerous mission in a generation, and then sat inside a burning capsule with no way to call home for 6 minutes, knowing that if the math was wrong, those girls would lose their remaining parent too. 4 days earlier, floating 550 kilometers from Earth, farther than any human had ever traveled, the crew had looked through Orion's windows at craters no human eyes had ever seen. Jeremy Hansen, voice cracking, told Houston that the crew wanted to name one of them Carol. A bright spot on the moon, he called it, visible from Earth at certain times of the lunar cycle. The crew wrapped their arms around each other and floated in silence, while Mission Control said nothing for 45 seconds. Victor Glover, the mission's pilot and the first black astronaut to fly beyond low Earth orbit, called the solar eclipse they witnessed from behind the moon one of the greatest gifts of the mission. Christina Koch, who already held the record for the longest continuous spaceflight by a woman, described the far side of the moon as something that defied the simulations they had studied for years. And Hansen, the Canadian Air Force colonel, who became the first non-American to fly beyond low Earth orbit, used the distance record moment to issue a challenge. He declared, "We choose this moment to challenge this generation and the next, to make sure this record is not long-lived." They came back through fire with a heat shield that everyone agreed was imperfect. Some called it safe enough. Some called it reckless. The crew called their spacecraft integrity and flew it anyway. When the parachutes opened and the capsule drifted toward the Pacific under 3 enormous canopies, the ISS crew watched from orbit, and astronaut Jessica Meir shared a photograph of the re-entry trail streaking across the atmosphere below them. Recovery teams from the USS John P. Murtha pulled alongside the bobbing capsule in inflatable boats. Ocean currents slowed the setup of the inflatable raft they call the front porch, the platform that would serve as a bridge between the capsule and the helicopters waiting to carry the crew to the ship. Divers entered the capsule to check on the astronauts and run initial medical evaluations. All 4 were in good shape. The undersea medical officer confirmed it. One by one, the astronauts climbed out of the hatch they had last used 10 days and nearly 700,000 meters ago. Wiseman came out last, stepped onto the raft, and looked up at a sky he had been falling through minutes earlier. Nikki Fox, NASA's Associate Administrator for Science, declared the re-entry picture perfect. The commentator Rob Nees, who had been narrating NASA missions for decades, finally let his emotions show. This is a perfect descent for integrity. Its crew sounding hale and hearty on board. NASA will inspect the Artemis II heat shield in the coming weeks. They will compare the char patterns to their models, measure the erosion, and determine whether the modified trajectory performed as predicted or whether they simply got lucky. For Artemis III, a redesigned shield with better permeability is already in production. The bet NASA made on Artemis II will not need to be made again. 13 minutes from atmosphere to ocean, 6 minutes of silence, 4 minutes of maximum heating where everything had to hold. And it did. 4 astronauts climbed into a capsule with a known flaw, trusted the engineers who said they understood it, and rode a controlled fireball to the surface of the Pacific Ocean at nearly 5 times the speed of a rifle bullet. We sent them to the moon because we could. We brought them home because the shield held. And somewhere on the near side of the lunar surface, there's a bright little crater that doesn't have an official name yet. The crew calls it Carol. If you know where to look, you can see it from your backyard during certain phases of the lunar cycle. A small bright spot on the boundary between the side of the moon we know and the side we are only beginning to explore. That feels about right.